I feel like I'm one of only a few people that actually understood the original Dead Space. And I don't mean that in a, oh, no one understands it but me, I'm so special kind of way, but in a, how the fuck can you idiots not see what is right in front of you kind of way. Yes, I'm talking about how Dead Space was regarded as, and therefore judged as, a survival horror game by most people. But it isn't. It so obviously isn't a survival horror game. It's an action horror game. The main focus of gameplay in survival horror games is, shockingly, surviving. And although survival is an element of Dead Space, it's no more an element of Dead Space than it is any other game where you can die. Gears of War is no less about survival than Dead Space, but no one's calling that game a fucking survival horror game. You know what the criterion for survival horror has become in the eyes of the mainstream gamer? Poorly lit environments. Anyway, the point being that Dead Space is not a game about surviving, it is a game about killing, and it does that very, very well. And Dead Space 2 is pretty much exactly the same. The whole horror element is still there. It has to be, given the context of the series. But just like the original, Dead Space 2 is all about the killing, and it does it very, very well. Dead Space 2 picks up 3 years after the original, with the protagonist Isaac Clarke now hanging out on a space city called the Sprawl, and those pesky necromorphs are at it again. If you recall the story of Dead Space, you'll understand why it is that Isaac has now spazzed out and gone mental. He's hallucinating like crazy, and he actually starts the game in a straitjacket, which is just great. The story has the same kind of MacGuffinal quality as the original, where you're given a series of objectives and then just go and do them. But the game doesn't have the same kind of structure as the original. In the original, the Ishimura was pretty much falling apart, and you were given location-based objectives that brought with them a sense of accomplishment when you completed them and made it back to the tram in one piece. Dead Space 2 is much more trivial. For most of the game, your objective is simply to get 2 other characters in the city. This is probably in response to the common criticism, with which I strongly disagreed by the way, that Dead Space 1 was overly formulaic. But whether you like the structure of the original or not, what they had in the original was simply much better than what's in Dead Space 2. Without these clear and diverse chapter by chapter objectives, Dead Space 2's chapters all blur together, and it feels like the computer game equivalent of an unpunctuated wall of text. But the real problem with the story is with the world building, or to be more precise, the lack thereof. The active narrative in Dead Space was great as motivation, but it wasn't very good as a story, and as I said, it was just a series of MacGuffins. But what made the original so captivating was the dense backstory with a history spanning hundreds of years. From Altman's discovery of the Black Marker on Earth to his conspiratorial assassination, to the rise of the Unitology cult, and then the Red Marker on Aegis 7, which was actually reverse engineered by humans, the hive mind and necromorph infection, the vast mausoleum ships of the Unitologists, and how everything is connected. It was dense and laid, and the kind of thing you could really sink your teeth into. And Dead Space 2 does of course use the foundation established in the original, but it doesn't build on it. Most of the logs in the original game fleshed out the backstory and added an enormous amount of depth, but here they mostly just ramble on about irrelevant crap. And without any new expanded universe story stuff, the game just feels as hollow and uninteresting as most other shooters out there. It's very obvious that celebrated graphic novelist Warren Ellis, who worked on the background story and structure for Dead Space, wasn't involved with Dead Space 2. And the setup for Dead Space 3, which we all knew was coming, so don't tell me I've spoilt anything for you, just pissed me off. They're teasing story for Dead Space 3, even as they fail to tell a story in Dead Space 2. Dead Space 2 also seems to be retconning the established lore in several ways, specifically relating to the hive minds, how the necromorph virus works, and what the marker is and its purpose. There are so few details in Dead Space 2 that it's hard to be sure exactly what actually happened, but things definitely have changed between Dead Space 1 and Dead Space 2 without any explanation. There are also a couple of canonic contradictions related to other Dead Space universe stuff, but they aren't important enough to get into here. A criticism levied against the original was that the environment was too samey, and while I don't hold that opinion, the developers' response to the complaint has definitely been positive. The new environment, the Titan station known as the Sprawl, a huge space city on one of Saturn's moons, has a fantastic range of environments. You pass through a hospital, a school, a church, a shopping centre, and even a few locations that aren't in Silent Hill games. But seriously, the environment truly is stunning and it's densely detailed. It feels like every single room was handcrafted with care, and even when certain rooms are repeated it feels believable because A, prefabs are to be expected on a modular space city, but B, because the little details change. And this fantastic environment also sits quietly in the background and just lets you absorb as much or as little of it as you like, as any good environment should. Unlike a certain other game set in a self-contained city which obnoxiously rubs the environment in your face at every opportunity. The one thing I don't like about the environment is that there's no real backtracking like there was in the original, which I feel always lends game environments a sense of cohesion and worldly credibility, especially when compared to the linear corridors with row upon row of locked doors found in most games, which is basically what Dead Space 2 does. If it seems like I'm dwelling on this stuff too much in what you suppose should be a review about the shooting, it's because it was this stuff on top of the great shooting in Dead Space 1 that made it such a landmark game. And Dead Space 2 is really lacking in many of these respects. But in every other way, and I'm sure they're the ways that most people care the most about, Dead Space 2 is a clear improvement. As with the original, here you face an infestation of the Necromorph virus, which transforms corpses into alien nasties, and you use an assortment of weapons to cut them into little bits. What made the combat of the original so interesting was that it subverted the aim for the head formula we're all so used to by forcing you to lop off the enemy's limbs. As an aside, people used to make fun of the fact that enemies in Dead Space would drop dead when you cut their arms off, while body shots did little damage, as if they must keep their vital organs in their arms or something. There was a perfectly good story explanation for enemies in Dead Space 1 to drop dead when you remove their arms, but with the ostensible DS2 retcon, it's hard to know what to make of it anymore. Nevertheless, the strategic dismemberment, as the developers call it, worked really well. Each enemy had its own unique vulnerable spots. For many it was the razor-sharp arms, for others it was huge bulbous joints, and for others still it was retractable tendrils or explosive sacs. What it meant was that not only were you not simply aiming for the head all the time, but you were always switching what you were shooting at as you fought different enemy types. And the game really exploited this by regularly throwing multiple enemy types at you all at once. For instance, a regular razor-armed necromorph might run at you from ahead, but then a suicide bomber necromorph with an explosive sac attached to its arm might drop down from an air vent behind you, while some little baby necromorph with tendrils that lob razor-sharp darts at you might be crawling on a wall to your left. What this meant for you was that you had 3 different enemies coming at you from 3 different directions, and each had to be fought in a different way. The game pushed a style of combat that was heavy on situational awareness and improvisation. You had to be well aware of what was going on around you, and you had to quickly evaluate and re-evaluate threats. In the above example, for instance, you might blast legs off the razor-arm necromorph to cripple it, reducing it to crawling around. Quickly turn around and stasis the suicide bomber, which causes him to move in super slow motion. Then sever his explosive sac at the arm. Use kinesis to pick it up and blast it at the baby on the wall. Then retreat to a safe distance to finish off the suicide bomber and the razor arm guy. It was truly thrilling combat. It was no secret that it was built on Resident Evil 4's combat model, where you could shoot weapons out of an enemy's hand or shoot them in the legs to make them fall to their knees, but Dead Space really dialed the idea all the way up to 11. And Dead Space 2 brings all of this back and expands on it with new enemy types and weapons. Most of the original enemies are back, and those that are gone you probably aren't going to miss, while the new enemies are all fantastic. The first you're introduced to is the Puker. This fellow isn't too much of a melee threat as he moves so slowly, but he does vomit acid on you from long range, which adds some much needed diversity to the roster of ranged attackers, and interestingly, rather than doing much damage to you, the acid significantly reduces your movement speed instead. It adds a great new type of threat to the game, it adds an extra element to the way groups of different necromorphs can work together, and it also gives us an enemy we can shoot in the head for a genuinely useful result, which was previously missing. There are also necromorph children, which are just loads of fun to slaughter, particularly as they tend to come at you in large groups. I think we can all agree that there's nothing as fun as killing children, and Dead Space 2 doesn't disappoint. There's also a fun new type of necromorph baby which borrows elements from a previous enemy, and they're just great fun. But the true star of the game has to be the Stalker. These guys look and act very similarly to how velociraptors are depicted in films, though as an aside let me point out that the common film version of the velociraptor isn't true to life at all. Stalkers hunt in packs, and I do mean hunt. They move very quickly, and their large heads which protect most of their body is well armoured, making their vulnerables tough to hit when they're charging at you at full speed. It's the way they work together that makes them so much fun to fight. They run around a lot and hide, which draws you into their kill zone. And then they have a habit of poking their heads out to watch you, which is just utterly captivating. While they're watching you, you just feel compelled to watch them back. But as you're making eyes at each other, one of their friends is flanking you and rams you from the side. They're cheeky little buggers, and I say this with total sobriety. They are by far the best enemy I've fought in a computer game in many years. There are a number of other enemies, and I won't talk about all of them, but one I have to mention is the tentacle replacement. If you played Dead Space 1, you'll remember those sequences where a tentacle grabs you. Dead Space 2 still has them in terms of basic concept, but they're a billion times better this time around, and they're also tied to cool cinematic cutscenes. But these are also used in moderation, so it works well. The game certainly isn't trying to be Call of Duty in space here, and it's a change that is just better in all ways. Then there are the new weapons added for the sequel, and I'm not going to say they're bad, but I will say that DS1 so thoroughly met the needs of the player that there just isn't much use for them. There's a sniper rifle which, well, a sniper rifle in Dead Space 2? I don't think so. And there's also a javelin gun which is pretty much just a harpoon gun. It's a neat weapon, but I feel that it undermines the strategic dismemberment element of the combat by encouraging you to aim for the chest. So despite being a potent gun, I think it dumbs down the combat a bit. By far the most fun new weapon is the detonator, which lets you fire sticky tripwire mines all over the place. And using the alternate fire mode, you can also disarm them so you can collect them to use them again. It's a weapon useful for cautious players who want to cover their backs, and it becomes disproportionately amazingly useful when replaying the game, as you can fairly easily remember where enemies came from and then exploit the balls out of that particular knowledge. Kinesis and stasis make a return, or the gravity gun and slow motion for those not familiar with the Dead Space lexicon. Kinesis is a much more useful tool now, as its speed and range have been given a buff, and it makes it a worthwhile combat tool, while it was seriously lacking in the original, which is definitely a good thing. Stasis, on the other hand, has been buffed into an overpowered tool. Recharger items are cheaper than they were in Dead Space 1, they drop far more frequently than they did in Dead Space 1, they stack in your inventory up to 3 per slot, and your stasis bar automatically recharges by itself. In the original, it was a useful tool with an element of resource management, making you use it carefully. In this sequel, you can just pretty much use it as often as you like, and while this doesn't undermine the overall combat experience, it certainly hurts it. The zero gravity stuff has been totally revamped. Instead of jumping around, you can now fly using little thrusters on Isaac's suit. This means you can no longer walk around on almost any wall you can see, but being able to fly adds a whole new dimension to the zero gravity sequences. As with the original, Zero G is largely the backdrop for puzzles, most of which are not even remotely impressive. And as with the original, there is very little combat in low gravity areas, and it's once again just limited to those tentacle babies. It's definitely a change for the better, but it also begs the question, why aren't they using it in proper combat situations? Because the new style of Zero G would be awesome with proper combat. And we know from Extraction that there are flying necromorphs. It's a serious missed opportunity, but it's also a clear improvement over the original, so let's call this one a score draw. An issue with Dead Space, at least for me, was that it was pretty easy. Normal difficulty was a joke. In fact, the only difficulty that was worth playing if you wanted any kind of challenge was impossible difficulty, which had to be unlocked by completing the game on one of the easier difficulties. That's bad in itself, but even impossible difficulty was pretty easy, meaning there is no true challenge for hardened Dead Space fans. Dead Space 2 resolves this, but it also goes way too far. The equivalent of impossible difficulty, called Zealot, is a fair bit harder than impossible was. It's still not super hard, but it's a definite challenge, and it no longer needs to be unlocked, which is just perfect. There's also a higher difficulty on top of Zealot called Hardcore, which does need to be unlocked, but no one would ever want to start on Hardcore, so that's okay. On Hardcore, the game is generally even harder than Zealot, and the checkpoint respawning system that exists in addition to the save stations is removed. If they'd left it there, it would be perfect, but they didn't. They also made it so that you can only save 3 times in the entire game. Dead Space 2 is an 8-hour long game once you know what you're doing, so if you do die, you have to replay a crazy amount. This turns the game into true survival horror, and it's a pretty exciting concept, but I find it alienating. Not because of having to replay 2 hours if I die, but because I have to play 2 hours before saving in the first place. I just don't want to have to play a game like Dead Space 2 in such large chunks, so I think they went way too far with hardcore difficulty, but Zealot is definitely a lot of fun. When multiplayer was first announced for Dead Space 2, it seemed like everyone felt that the single player would suffer as a result. Although I do think the single player is weaker than the original in some ways, I definitely don't think the multiplayer is the cause, and it happens to be a lot of fun to play as well. It plays like Versus mode in Left 4 Dead, as a team of 4 humans take on a team of 4 necromorphs in a small arena-like level where the humans have to complete objectives and the necromorphs have to stop them. Like L4D Versus, the humans have to work as a team and watch each other's backs, and like L4D Versus, the necromorphs have to work as a team to make the humans split up and then gang up on individuals. Really, it's hard to find things to say about it. It's just like L4D Versus, except in third person and featuring dead babies. They went the Call of Duty route and added experience points and a leveling system, which I just fucking hate. I can't see a single justifiable reason to have this crap in a competitive game, but the game is good fun regardless. The only real problem with it, besides the stupid leveling mechanic, is that it just feels amateurish. There are no dedicated servers or server browsers, so that's pretty annoying, and hit detection is kind of mental as a result, as it seems to accommodate for lag in a huge way. It's possible to jump at an enemy human to bite them and completely miss, yet still somehow successfully grab hold of him. The animations for the necromorphs are also taken from the single player game rather than being new animations added for the multiplayer, so things like running sideways, which single player necromorphs don't do, just look ridiculous. Similarly, the camera position for the necromorphs looks exactly like what you'd get if some amateur modder made a third person camera mod out of a first person game. It looks all wrong and amateurish. And the whole multiplayer component is like that. It feels like an amateur-made mod. But don't get me wrong, it is just a lot of fun to play, and I definitely recommend it if you want something pretty much identical to Left 4 Dead Versus. If all you cared about in Dead Space was the shooting, you're probably going to be perfectly happy with the sequel. A few mistakes were made, but overall it does exactly what an iterative sequel ought to do. It provides the same experience again, except better. If, like me, you felt that Dead Space was much more than just a horror-themed shooter, then you're probably going to find Dead Space 2 lacking in some areas. But it's definitely not lacking as a shooter. In fact, as a shooter it's better than the original in nearly all ways. And although I feel the game hasn't lived up to its full potential, it's still easily one of the best third-person shooters available for the PC.